Built by horse players for horse players, AmWager is designed for speed, power, and ease of use. AmWager brings CAW-style tools to everyday horse players, including Dutching, ABC Ticket Maker, and Pro%, an advanced betting tool that lets you assign weighted percentages and build multiple structured wagers with a single click. Every month, AmWager turns the odds in your favor with 0% takeout on select tracks. These promos offer you up to $100 more for your winning bets and giving you value for your wagers not offered anywhere else. Rated 4.7 stars on Google with over 200 reviews, AmWager is trusted by horse players who expect more from their wagering platform. If you're looking for better tools and better value, you need AmWager. Void where prohibited. For terms and conditions, visit amwager.com. Must be 18 or older, 21 or older where applicable. Gambling problem? Please call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY.
Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. Welcome to episode 56 of the Bet with the Best podcast. This is part one of a reprise of a previous episode in which we discussed with pro player Mike Maloney how to handicap and bet the Kentucky Derby. In this part one episode, we discussed how to handicap the Derby. In the following part two episode, we discussed how to use your handicapping opinions to create smart bets on the Kentucky Derby. If you want to learn more about how to handicap and bet the Kentucky Derby or any other horse race, then you should go to Bet with the Best Media. That's all one word, betwiththebestmedia.com, to order my new book, Betting on Horses, at the early bird discounted price. Each chapter of the book focuses on a crucial aspect of horse playing as practiced by some of the most successful players of the past several decades. Featured contributors include influential authors and horse players such as Andrew Beyer, Stephen Christ, Mark Kramer, and Barry Meadow, as well as leading professional players like Mike Maloney, Paul Matisse, Sean Borman, and Jonathan Stetton. And even a younger generation of data-driven players, including Marshall Graham, Dennis Montoro, Keith Bush, and David Aragona. The book covers all major elements of successful horse playing, from race selection and value identification to pool selection, bet sizing, and efficient ticket construction. It also addresses critical but often overlooked areas such as bankroll management, horse player psychology, and even performance review. If you're a horse player, whether novice or experienced and looking to improve your game, this book was written for you. So don't wait to order Betting on Horses now to get the early bird discounted price at betwiththebestmedia.com. Betwiththebestmedia.com. Joining me this week is pro player Mike Maloney to go into depth about how to bet on the Kentucky Derby. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Good to be on with you, Chris.
Yeah, this will be fun. I mean, we're recording this before even all the Derby preps are finished, so we're not going to talk about this year's Derby, but we're going to talk about, in general, how you approach the Derby in terms of handicapping and betting, and how and why it's sort of so much different than any other race you see in the U.S. So I think it could be really helpful to people going into this year's Derby, help them get ready, handicap, and bet on the race. So I'm really looking forward to that. So to get us started, I just thought we would start with kind of discussion about what is it that makes the Derby so unique? Why is it so much different than any other race? So, and kind of highlight what you think are the major differences that you have to factor into your thinking.
Okay. It's, it really is a unique race. The Kentucky Derby, you're sending 3-year-olds a mile and a quarter in May, first Saturday in May. So you're asking young horses, to do something that they've never done, go a distance they've never been. You're putting them in almost always a 20-horse field, which we don't see in American racing. You're putting them in front of 150,000 screaming, inebriated fans. It's just a unique experience for the patrons, for the jockeys, for the horses, and for the trainers too. So it lends itself to unusual things happening, and so my approach from 40,000 feet is this is a race where mayhem, can occur and regularly does, as evidenced by a horse like Rich Strike. So if I'm going for, I'm not wanting to be on a short price horse. I'm trying to be forced to go to a shorter price horse because of the 20 horses in the race and the mayhem that can occur. So I'm always looking for value in the race, and it's you just have to approach it with a different mindset, because you see 6-1 on a horse that is a strong contender in the race, and from your everyday horse player, your initial reaction is, oh, that's a good price. But in a 20-horse field, even though the horse is a strong contender, it may not be a good win price. So it's just a different type race, and you have to approach it with a whole different mindset.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. And I would add one other feature to the Derby that you didn't mention. Maybe it's not a big deal, but this is the race everybody wants to win, right? And in fact, American racing has become, I think, way too Derby-centric in terms of the breeding, the training. I mean, this is the race every owner, every trainer, every jockey really wants to win. And so they might do things to get ready for this race that they wouldn't do in any other case. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree with that. And from, a few travels around Europe, for instance, in my lifetime, when people ask where you're from and you say Kentucky, the only thing that pops in their mind is Kentucky Derby. So you get that question, continually when you're out of the States, and it's a worldwide known race, and like you say, everyone in the industry wants to win it, and unfortunately, over the years there have been a lot of talented young horses that weren't really suited or ready for the Derby that have been chewed up in the attempt to win the Derby.
Yeah, there is a graveyard of on the Derby trail for sure. Not literally, although in a few cases maybe, but you're right. Especially the ones that aren't really suited for it, it can really do damage to them when they try to, train them into that race. You also, the other key thing I think you mentioned was that that kind of counterintuitive, wow, this is I think the most likely winner. I'm getting 6-1, wow, 6-1 the most likely winner. It's got to be a great bet. But when you start doing the math, like if you try to come up with a fair odds line in a 20-horse race, if you're realistic and you give most of the horses at least some fractional chance of winning, 6-1 might not look nearly as good as you think once you do the math. And I think that's the point you're trying to make, and that's a really good one. And that comes into play, in all, even the exotic wagers, the exactas and trifectas. I mean, the number of combinations with a 20-horse field is just something people aren't used to dealing with.
Absolutely. It's I don't know if we're ready to get into that yet, but when you get into the exotic wagering on the Kentucky Derby, my approach is especially when I get in past the exacta, when I get into the tries and the supers and the super high five, the super verticals, as I call them, when I get into those bets, I kind of do away with odds. I'm looking for key horses that I can trust to at least get a part of, at least hit the board, let's say. And that's more important to me than splitting hairs on, is this horse value at 8-1 or should I not key him if he's 6-1? I don't pay any real attention to that when I'm looking at the deep verticals, because you have to have keys. Even someone that's willing to play a significant amount of money like myself, you still have to have keys that you can rely on. And the price is not nearly as important to me as the consistency of the horse and the strength of your projections of that horse running his race in the Derby.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're thinking about it like you would say in a pick six, where you've got 3 or 4 legs you've already worked through, and you figure if you can hit this thing, it's going to pay. And I got a couple more races that I've got to get through to hit that. I'm just trying to get through them. I'm not really that worried about, adding value on. If I can hit this, it's going to pay. And so I want to try to cut down the combinations and make it affordable so I have a chance to hit it. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Or am I misunderstanding?
That's totally what I'm thinking. And to be, to just be realistic about it, usually, even in the trifecta, but definitely if you get into the superfecta, I have to key at least 2 slots. So I'm trying to find 2 horses that I can rely on to either run in the top 3 for the tri or the top 4 for the super. And sometimes I'll say, one horse that I really like has to run first or second. And then I'll say the other horse might just have to run in the top 4. So there's all kinds of techniques like that you can bring into it to try to keep the cost down. But usually the payoff is not the problem in deep verticals and on the Kentucky Derby. The problem is you used, the horses, but you couldn't get them all on the same ticket. So, I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard that from my horse playing friends on Derby races and Derby pick sixes and anything to do with the Derby. It's just a tough task to try to, to bring that down on Derby Day, because there's always going to be surprises. Not always. Once in a while you get a really formful result. But if you're playing the Derby every year and you're a serious horse player and you're somebody that puts a lot of time in the game, I think the logical thing to do is to approach your bets in the Derby as there's going to be mayhem most years, and I want to be there when the mayhem happens. I want to be there when the prices hit. And if they run in a superfecta that pays a few $100s, then, maybe that just wasn't meant to be my year.
Yeah, I can, I think of years where the favorite won and the super still paid really big,
Absolutely. That's happened a lot.
So like you said, if you can find that one reliable horse, even if it's a favorite, and you play it on the top, you insist on it maybe running first or second, you could still catch a really big payout. And I don't have all the historical super payouts in front of me, but I know, because I've caught 1 or 2 that they paid pretty well, even when the favorite does run well. But I want to kind of hold off. I really do want to get into, especially the superfecta, because of the dollar minimum that they do in the Derby with the superfecta and the 20-horse field. It does create, I think, a unique betting opportunity that you just don't have any other time during the year. And you kind of are hinting at that already. So I want to spend time on that. But before we do that, I want to do some of the handicapping, kind of figure out how you can zero in on some of those horses you can lean on, and then we can kind of go through the different kinds of bets and how you might factor your opinion into and turn it into a wager. But I did want to ask one other general question, because you again kind of hinted at that. Once a year you have this opportunity. Because it only happens once a year and is a unique opportunity, do you kind of approach it differently than just another day at the races? Like, you might try a little bit harder to make sure you cash something on this day than you would on another day, or is it just another day at the races for you?
Well, it's a unique day, and my daily play is, my money management is grounded by limits each day, but my limits are based on the amount that I'm allowed to lose in a particular day or a particular week. So I raise those limits on Derby Day, Breeders' Cup weekend. I play at my maximum, but inside the race day on Derby Day, I'm not doing a whole lot different other than just dealing with really large fields and maybe trying to be a little more inclusive in the horizontals leading up to the Derby. I would like to be live to my best horse, even at the minimum bet amount in the Derby, because if you've had a couple of upsets leading up to that, you can have just a tremendous payout into the Derby. And if I'm live to my top pick, that gives me options where I can play, an exacta saver, or I can come up with some type of strategy based off the live ticket that I have. And that works also in the verticals in the Derby. I want this thought of inclusion. I want to really grind on my bet structure for the trifecta, and to some degree, I'm going to grind on my bet structure for the superfecta out of necessity too. But I want to try to be creative in writing tickets that give me the opportunity when my 8th or 10th choice in the race runs 4th in the super, and I'm kind of right about the rest of it. That's a scenario where it's so easy to miss that, to near miss on that super. I want to take my very best shot and to really grind on those tickets to give me my best shot to pick up that, that super that pays $100,000, let's say. There can be a big effect on your whole year, just whether or not when you're kind of right. There are going to be some years when you're just all wet, and that's racing. But there are lots of times, and I'm sure horse players can relate to this, where you're on the verge. You say, sometimes when the race ends, you're not even sure whether you had it or not, because you were tinkering with that horse on the bottom, and you just used it in a couple of small wagers where you were being really, just using your best picks on top of this unlikely horse to run in the 4th slot. So, and it's a long-winded way of saying that one of the differences on Derby Day is I'm willing to spend a lot of time trying to structure these tickets to where when I look back, on the Sunday that follows the Derby, I'm not just kicking myself for, there's a way that you could have caught that, Mike, if you would have just, ground out a few more creative tickets.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Like, I've watched the Derby with some friends and family before, and I we're all betting, and the horse wins that I've been telling him to play, and they're all excited. I'm sitting here trying to figure out, did that horse run? Who ran fourth? I couldn't tell, who ran fourth.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing that really matters, If we got that fourth place horse, that's the big score. They don't understand it. They figure the horse
That's
just
right.
won, which is good. But it's that super I want to hit,
Exactly. If it's $100,000 super, it's hard to bet enough to win on a 6 or 8 to 1 shot to make it up to $100,000.
And that just, you don't have that many opportunities in on a normal betting week. It just doesn't come up very often. So it does sound like you're kind of looking for two things, and we'll get into the handicapping now. Is A, you're trying to find that horse or two you can lean on, right? Maybe in both verticals and horizontals, and then what are those kind of chaos horses that might blow up the verticals in the Derby that you don't want to leave off, right? That's kind of what you're looking for.
Exactly. Where's the it's been a while since he did this, but where's the Dallas Stewart horse that's going to show up that's very hard to find on paper?
Exactly. All right, so let's talk about handicapping. So I want to start, maybe this is the easy part, is what are the fundamentals, the key fundamentals that hold on the Derby, just like any other race? That it's pretty much like any other race. You need, what would you say are the main things that really don't change, that you can kind of approach those parts of the handicapping the same way you would any other race?
Well, first I'm going to preface this a little, and this will probably come up several times while we're having our conversation today, Chris. Is the point system for the Derby came into effect in 2013, the year that Orb won. And that changed everything for me. The first thing I was going to mention, and you're asking for a list of the things that you look for, was pace. And pace dynamics of the Derby were, I guess, forever changed in 2013. So in my mind, in my way of handicapping, there's pre-point system Derby was an entirely different animal than post-point system Derby handicapping. So, what was in the past doesn't matter now, I guess, but I think it's just important to mention it, because if you're going through Derby stats and Derby results, my advice is to have a hard break at 2013 and to analyze those results differently going forward, because I think it turned into a different race. Now, to answer your question about what you look for, pace is still important. What you generally find in the Derby is, you generally find a solid pace. There's nearly always someone willing to take the lead in the Derby. That's not a choke down situation like you see on the turf in New York sometimes, where they're all looking at each other. The jocks are looking at each other, and nobody wants the lead. It's not that situation. So usually some jock is glad to go to the front, and the pace is honest. And, the other factors determine the race. What are the other factors? You want to be leaning toward horses that you feel comfortable about the distance. We may have deeper discussion about that. I don't have a lot, I don't think, to offer there. It seems like more and more the majority of the horses in the race, if they get the right setup, they seem to get the 1.25 miles. I think something that's overlooked sometimes in the Derby handicapping is the versatility of a horse. what's commonly known in racing as a push button horse. And, that just most listeners probably know what we're talking about, but, it's just a horse that can go to the front. He can lay off the pace. And a lot of those type horses, even if they get pushed back to fourth, fifth, sixth early, they can still run into the race on the turn and get their position. And it doesn't take away their finish. They're just very versatile about when they can be used in a race, when they can be asked to run, as opposed to some horses that they have a run that's a quarter of a mile, or they have a run that's 3/8 of a mile long, and you have to time that correctly because that's all they're going to give you. A push button horse might give you more options as a rider, and in a 20 horse field, that's incredibly important because chances are you're going to run into traffic. You're not going to have your perfect setup. You're going to have to make some decisions during the race. And if you're on a horse that has gears and can stop and start maybe one time during the race and overcome that, that's a big difference. So that's something that I'm always looking for in horses that participate in the Derby. And I think that's an underappreciated factor. And then there's a lot of connection things that come into play for the trainer. Is it someone who has been there before? Is it someone who tends to do well in longer dirt routes? Is it someone that horses tend to improve at that time of year? And the riders come into play. But most top riders, I think, are capable of winning the Derby. The riders that I'm careful with are maybe a rider that is young and this is his first experience at the Derby. Even though he's a talented rider, I'm gonna be a little cautious there. Or a rider that is experienced, but he's done most of his work at a smaller track and maybe hasn't been on this kind of a stage before. I might be careful with a rider like that too. So and I'm just probably just touching the surface here of all the things that we really think about when we handicap the Derby race, but those are a few of the main ones.
Yeah, so let's I like all those points. I just want to follow up a little bit. So distance, that's at the start you mentioned, this is 1.25 miles. These horses, at least most all the time, have never been that distance before. Occasionally there's been a horse that has. Is there anything that you look at, breeding, final pace figures, anything like that you rely on to help you give you confidence you're going to go 1.25 miles? Or I'm just curious what you look at.
Yeah, a couple of things. I've been in racing so long. I'm hitting about 50 years now of handicapping almost daily and paying attention to the horses. And sometimes during that period, not as much as I pay attention now, but being immersed in racing for 50 years. So it's kind of easy for me now because I saw the I'll look at a sire. I saw his daddy run, and I probably saw his granddaddy run. So I have a pretty good idea in my head of what lines are okay, and honestly, it seems like most. I used to put a lot of effort into being so sure that a horse could get the Derby distance, and honestly, it's horses that California Chrome comes to mind, a horse that you would never be excited by the horse's breeding or his pedigree, but he was a stayer. He didn't have any problem with the 1.25 miles. And that I don't have the reason for that, but that just seems to be more the case now than it was before the point system went into play. And my explanation for that would be that the paces were often pre-point system, pre-2013. The paces were often so intense in the Derby. Intense is not even the word. They were crazy. They were supersonic. It seemed like maybe half the time, and it just melted horses. And it put more emphasis on the breeding, because it was like you were running 1.5 miles. But you take 1.25 miles for the young horses that have never been that far, and then you put them in an intense pace situation, and it just makes it even harder on horses that don't necessarily have a stayer's pedigree. Now, post 2013, it doesn't seem like the breeding matters as much, and I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, because it does, but it doesn't. If I see a really talented 3-year-old, I'm very hesitant now to eliminate him or severely downgrade him on breeding alone, just because I've been burned on that, post 2013. And, I've learned that that's not necessarily quite the factor that it was before. To go a little deeper into that, I'm just looking at a rough, quick look at a horse's overall pedigree. Like if he's by Curlin, if he's out of a Curlin mare, for instance, then I'm not probably going to worry about, can he get the distance? I'm going to assume that he can. And I'm also going to look at the dam of the horse, the dam of the 3-year-old, and look at her progeny, and look at see if the horses she's produced, if any of them have shown that they're a stayer. And if she's a young mare that doesn't have a lot of foals that have raced, I'll go back to the Grand Dam. I just want to get a little idea from the mare side what kind of distance most of those horses preferred. And I don't need to see a lot. If there's some successful routers in that dam pedigree, then I'm gonna slightly upgrade the prospects of the horse, and just feel more comfortable with the horse, and be more likely to key the horse, to really have confidence in the horse to get the distance. And we'll probably talk more about that in the betting part.
But it does sound like even though you think now maybe the breeding, you're less likely to fade a horse because of breeding, but you still like to see that in terms of trying to identify that horses you really want to lean on. You'd like to see them have some sort of distance pedigree that gives you some confidence that they'll get the 1.25 miles. Is that a good summary?
Yes, that's a good summary. I want to try to find out everything I can. When after the Derby is drawn, I'll look at it and come to a conclusion, a couple of days before the Derby, usually, what horses I'm looking at keying. And once I get that far in the process, I don't do a lot of work before, the horses get to the Churchill for Derby preparations. And once I have an idea of who I might key, then I'm going to go back and do a lot of this work to make sure that I'm comfortable with everything I can find about the potential key horse. the other horses that are inclusions and contenders, I've learned through practice to be careful with, saying, well, that horse can't win. It might hit the board, but it can't win because it's California Chrome. And I didn't say that with that particular horse, but I'm just using it as an example. His pedigree is a little short for 1.25 miles, and I think that'll cost him in the stretch. Well, that hasn't played out so well in the actual practice. So I'm a firm believer in I want to operate on what actually happens on the racetrack. I don't want to get lost in theory, and I want to know about theory. I want to have a lot of ideas. I want to try to think outside the box. But everything with me, no matter if it's a Derby or it's a third race at Mahoning Valley on Tuesday, everything with me is linked back to what's happening on the track right now today. So I want to make sure that I stay in tune with that, and what's happened on the track in the Derby has just pushed me away from making bold throwouts of horses that seem to be lacking on pedigree.
Yeah, I think part of I would attribute that part of it is like almost none of the horses are bred to go 1.25 miles anymore. So maybe that's part of the reason why it's not quite as important, right? They're all looking for early speed, and precocity. So that might have something to do with that.
There's a lot of truth to that.
So what about on the track? There's a lot of these, systems for picking the Derby, and like they'll say, you got to get an eighth, the final eighth, or the final quarter in a certain amount of time, or people look at late pace figures. I mean, is there anything in the PPs that you're looking for that will give you confidence that they're going to get the distance, or just anything in that regard?
I haven't used those final finishing times, but I've noticed, I think if I'm right, you've used those to some degree. And I think I noticed, like maybe on Twitter or something, you had posted something. Is that right? Yeah,
what I do is a little bit different. I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you mentioned it, I want this to be more about what you think than me. But I've been doing this for a long time. I actually built a model to pick the Derby, to handicap the Derby way back in the early 80s. And part of that model was taking the PPs and internal fractions run on their final Derby prep. It usually was 1.125 miles at that time. Still is for the most part. And then based on the way they ran, projecting out how they would finish up at 1.25 miles if they basically ran the same race again, but up farther distance. So it uses a little math and stuff. So that way it takes into account because problem with just looking at final fractions is there's such a function of how the early part of the race went. I mean, like, for instance, the Tampa Bay Derby, this year they absolutely crawled on the front end. I mean, you could almost not go any slower than they went in a horse race for the first 6 furlongs. So, of course, all those horses are going to come flying home because all they did was jog for the first part of the race. Where if you get into a race where they go super fast early, they're all gassed at the end, and of course they're going to stagger home. So, this is sort of looking at that and saying, all right, what would project out going forward. So it's just another piece of information, but I think it's better than just looking at the final fractions because it takes into account the whole race. And it's certainly better than just breeding because it's taking into account, how the horses have actually performed on the track prior to the Derby. So I do that, and I do post it on Twitter, and I'll do it again this year after they run all the final preps. Sometimes horses, because they come out of races that had strange paces, it kind of throws off the projection. But in general, it usually kind of identifies the main contenders and the ones that are likely to, they all can run 1.25 miles, as everyone says. It's just how fast they run it. And it usually can pick out the ones that are more likely to run faster than the others going that distance. Yeah, that makes total sense. And that's kind of what I thought
that you did, and that, sounds useful. It's just not something that I've done. I guess I'm more of a lot of what I do is seat of the pants handicapping maybe, but it's just what I'm comfortable with. But I'm also, and this is a good lesson for horse players, I think. I'm also always looking for new information from smart people. So when you post something like that, I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to take a look at that and factor that in to some degree. I'm going to hope that it confirms what my opinions already are to that point. But if it doesn't, if it points out a horse that I am against, that your data is pointing to, then that's important for me to go back and take another look, just like you would if a horse you've eliminated is all of a sudden 3-1 on the tote board. You just go back and take that other look, and it doesn't mean you're going to change your mind. But I think all horse players have to continue to learn and continue to try to factor in different ideas in order to keep up with the changes in the game.
Yeah, it sounds like something like that might make you think, this is a horse maybe I'll include in my exotics. I'm probably not going to change your opinion on your key horses, but maybe you might, include a horse that you hadn't thought about including before. If you kind of were on the kind of on the fence on that horse, that might be enough to push you over into it. And I think prefacing it by, you trust the source of information to some extent, because I was going to bring this up. We might as well talk about it now. The cacophony of noise you get around the Derby of advice is like no other time during the year, right? I mean, you hear all the trainers talk, you hear all these pundits, you get all these rules of horses that can't or can win the Derby. I mean, what's your advice on that? Do you just shut it out? Is there what in there that you get? What kind of information do you get about the Derby that is useful that you don't normally get? Is there any such thing? I mean, just how do you deal with all that noise?
Absolutely, that's a great question. I ignore probably 98% of it because, like you say, everybody seems to be positive on their horse as they're leading up to the Derby. And that's natural. It's Derby fever is a real thing. I've been around people that have caught it, and it lasts until the morning after the Derby. And there's no known cure that I know of. I mean, you just catch it and you have it. But the information that I am trying to pay attention to is, number one, is there a physical issue with a Derby contender? And the trainer will always say, it's taken care of. That's not going to bother him. Or, the vet says 100% okay, whatever. I've found through the years that when a horse has any type of physical issue, whether they think it's been dealt with or not, if it's enough that it's in the conversation Derby week, then there's no way I'm going to key that horse. I don't care if he's Secretariat. And sometimes they'll run through it, but it's been my experience that is valuable information. And I'm talking about, a little bit of a sore foot, a horse not, and I'm not talking about just a psychological freak out like Fusiaci Pegasus, where he's almost killing Neil Drysdale in the morning while they're trying to get him to work. I'm talking about a horse that maybe has a foot issue, and whether it's something they're trying to trim him down and put a different shoe on, or they're talking about a bar shoe, or they're or they're, he's had quarter crack issue or whatever, whatever it may be. If that's significant enough that it comes up in the conversation, I think it's something to pay attention to. And then I should have put this next to the Neil Drysdale Fusiichi Pegasus comment. But also, when a horse is training, there are people that we all probably listening to the same people, that observe the physical nature of the horse. And, for me, it's people like the Works Show on FanDuel TV. I don't even know if they'll have that this year, but in previous years, listen to Simon Bray, Tom Amos, people like that. Listen to Mike Welch, it's with DRF. Those type of observations from seasoned horsemen that I trust are really important to me. Like I'll listen to in the money media, they may have Frank McGoey or somebody on that's observed Derby works. I'm going to listen to that because I think he's a super sharp guy. So that is the type Derby. One other thing on the Derby comments and the Derby interviews is if a trainer says a horse, there's something we improved on this horse. Hey, the change of blinkers in the last race, and maybe it's not blinkers on, blinkers off. It can be, cutting back a cup, changing a bit. It can be any of a number of things like that. A comment like that explains to me the horse's improvement in that last race. Maybe that change was made only before the last prep race. That means a lot to me because then I'm more inclined to judge that horse solely off his last race, which may lead to a lot of value in a bet because everyone else can't get past his second race back that wasn't good. So those are the type of things that I'm looking for that might really sway me on my handicapping in the Derby.
Yeah, as you were talking through that, I was just trying to think back through examples of some of what you said, and like the minor foot problem one, the horse that I remember the most is Unbridled Song, who was a brilliant horse, but he was dealing with foot issues, and that was a big deal going up to the Derby, and he still ran pretty well despite that. But that was one horse that kind of stuck out at me as maybe he was the best horse if he had been healthy that year, but those problems were enough to kind of knock him out of winning the race. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Do you remember him?
Yeah, I do. And I think Point Given, I think there may have been some rumors around Point Given Derby week about foot issues.
Yeah, he always had them through his whole career. So I think you're probably right. So that's really interesting. So anything else on that? Because what I want to talk about now again is kind of go back to the handicapping and the fact that the Derby is a 20-horse field. That unique part of it, given that it's a 20-horse field, and you kind of hit on this already, versatility might be a big, good attribute for horse. But is there certain kinds of running styles? Do you prefer horses that are typically forwardly placed, or do you like the horses that settle farther back, or does it really, I'm just curious, is there a certain kind of running style that would incline you to, be more likely to lean on that horse as a key horse in the Derby?
I would love to find, the optimum thing for me is to find that push button horse, which I would describe, California Chrome, American Pharoah. Those are, horses that people will remember that I think of in that vein. Those are horses that they have a high cruising speed. If you let them, if you give them the lead and they can do it, in hand, they're fine to take the lead and just go on. But if somebody else wants the lead and they get that good tracking position, 2 or 3 lengths off the lead, maybe third or fourth in the race, that's just perfect, in the Derby, as long as it's not a meltdown pace scenario, which doesn't seem to happen that often post point system. So that's the optimum trip. Another trip that I feel comfortable with is a horse that I feel confident in his finish. I feel like he's the best finisher in the race. And if I'm confident that there's going to be, doesn't have to be a meltdown pace, but if I'm confident that there's going to be a real solid pace, then I'm comfortable keying a consistent closer. And when I say closer, I bet Street Sense back in 2007, I think, and he came from last. That's okay in a certain scenario, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for. There are horses that will lay, that can lay mid-pack, and they're still going to have plenty of finish. And that's another okay scenario for me in the Derby, because those horses have, they can drop back far enough where they can generally find an okay trip. They can generally settle somewhere in a decent spot, and then they can get swung outside and put that finish in. So those are two types of trips that seem to come up a lot, and those are two trips that I've keyed a lot in the Derby.
So the first one, you kind of not necessarily the horse being the push button, but it seems like now, especially since the point system was introduced, that like half the field is the kind of the looking for the trip you described at first. They tend to want to be forwardly placed. Just they're willing to take the lead or sit just off. But now you've got a dozen of those horses in the race, so that kind of brings up the field size and post position. So, in that kind of scenario, which isn't unusual at all, it doesn't seem like anymore. What sort of post are you hoping? What are you thinking are preferable for that kind of a horse?
Well, I would prefer an outside post. It's kind of dependent on the horse. One helpful thing to at least look at is if you have access, I think most of us do today, to pace figures, to a good set of pace figures. I made mine own for, 30 years. Now I kind of rely on Timeform US and a couple other things I look at to give me an idea how the race is going to set up. And what you're looking for there, but I guess it's pretty obvious, is the ideal scenario is when the horse that you're interested in, the horse that you think will pass can pass horses, that's the push button horse. When his pace figures are, in the same neighborhood as the projected leaders in the race, then the push button horse can place himself nearly, a high percentage of the time in a favorable position. And just the idea behind that is, there are 6 or 8 horses that look like they want that spot, but the ones that are going to get that spot are the ones with the 120 pace figure, and the horses that have the 100 pace figure that their style is to lay in that same position, they're not going to get there. Or if they do get there, they're going to be used too hard to get there. and they're not going to have anything left for the second part of the race. So the early pace figures are very useful in, where can your horse lay, not where could he be off his fastest pace figure, but where can, off his normal pace figure, where can he lay comfortably? And that's the kind of thing I'm looking at. And so even if you draw the 20 with a California Chrome or American Pharaoh, I think, you're probably still okay as long as the track's fair that day at Churchill, which it usually is on Derby day. I mean, at least by Derby race. And, you can lay outside, and you may be a little wide in the first turn while you're waiting for everything. You're trying to stay out of the way of some of the mayhem. But then by the time they get on the backside, you've angled down to where you're in the 3 or 4 path, and you're almost guaranteed a good trip from there on.
Yeah, you made a good point that there is that long run to the first turn, even though it's a mile and a quarter. That you get pretty much a quarter mile run to that first turn. So even from the post 20, there's quite a bit of time to start angling over. And the geometry is that you don't really run much farther, and on a straight diagonal to the rail it's only a few feet farther than, coming from the rail. That's one of the people think that you lose a lot of ground by angling over, but you really don't. So you got horses that are angling over to get towards the inside in that big field. What if your horse you like isn't one that can be up there near the front? What's the best post for them, given that there are going to be faster early pace horses probably trying to angle over during that first part of the race? Where would you like to see, say, if you're playing one of the other kinds of horses you like that have the finish but maybe are sitting mid-pack or farther back, what would be the best post for them?
That's a tougher question. And I think it kind of depends on the horse a little bit. My initial reaction would be to say a middle type post, a 8 to 12 kind of deal. But, that's just off the top of my head. I don't have anything to back that up. I would be thinking more, I would think a horse like that, most of the posts would be okay given the right ride and the things you would worry about. I would be more sensitive then. I would be more concerned about extreme outside or inside, because look at extreme inside first. If you're 10th going down the stretch the first time and you're on the rail, you don't have a lot of options. You're catching, and everybody's trying to angle down. So there's certainly horses in front of you on the rail. And there are also horses trying to come down to save a little ground going in the first turn. You're going to get a ton of kickback, and you're not going to have many options right there. What are you going to do? You're going to try to back out of that kickback, or the horse might do it for you and just, kind of throw his head up and slow down a little bit. You could try to get out a couple of paths immediately, but most likely there's going to be horses that are trying to angle down, and that's not going to be available to you. So that can be a claustrophobic, tough trip, especially for like a middle of the pack type horse, not a deep closer, but a horse that does his best running from off the pace, but is not a deep 20 lengths out of the closer. And same thing for a horse on the extreme outside. If you're a horse that drops back to dead last, if you're going to run the style that Street Sense ran in his Derby, it might be okay, because maybe Calvin Burrell would just grab a hold and drop into the rail and be 20 lengths back and be fine with that. But there are a lot of horses that are not speed horses that draw out extreme outside, and you have horses inside of you, and that's just the luck of how the race plays out, whether there are 3 horses inside of you or 6 horses inside of you. But if there are, more than 3, what do you do at that point? I mean, you can try to speed up, but maybe that takes your horse out of its style. You can just let your horse run comfortably where he is. Well, you might be 8 wide in the first turn if you do that. So it puts the inside with kind of I don't know exactly the right term, maybe mid-pack horses, we'll call them. The extreme inside and the extreme outside, I think, can create problems. Maybe you get lucky and there's a pocket that you can drop into and it's a non-factor. But in trying to predict what's going to happen before the race, I think you have a little extra concern about horses that draw into those positions.
Yeah, I really agree with you on the kind of the mid pack on the outside. Given 20 horses, you got 19 inside of you, it's hard to envision anything but getting parked 4 or 5 wide, on the turn. And then you probably are stuck there for the whole race. And that seems like almost an impossible task unless you're just much the best. So that mid pack runner, extreme outside post, to me, that's really probably the worst draw to have. And like you said, if you have the speed, you can kind of, get position without taking your horse out of the game, right? Or if you're a real drop back type, you can just drop back. But at mid pack, you really don't have any options from that post. And so, to me, that would be like the worst draw would be a mid pack runner way outside. That makes a lot of sense to me.
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
Whereas, like you said, if the horse can handle it can kind of handle being in and behind and take some kickback down on the inside, you might be okay. But like you said, the problem there is you don't have options. So every once in a while on the Derby, you'll have, some horse does something crazy and a whole bunch of horses have a really bad trip going into that first turn. Not every year that happens, but I can think of a few years where, 5, 6 horses kind of lose all chance just in that first turn.
Exactly. And then this is going back a few years, but I'm just trying to throw in some examples of some of these things as we go along. But Jerry Bailey was a rider that was one of my favorite riders anyway, but especially on Derby Day, he was a guy that was just a miracle worker at taking a bad initial position in the Derby and, maybe using a little horse prematurely to get a better position, to get a proper position. And he had just a knack of being able to do that without taking too much out of his horse. And he was also great at timing the winning move in derbies, or the get into contention move. I know the good riders normally don't just sit there and take the terrible trip. If they see that, they quickly identify, hey, I'm in the wrong spot, this is not going to end well, and they will make a proactive move to try to, even if they have to use a little horse, they'll make a proactive move early to try to put themselves in a better position, and then maybe give the horse a little breather inside the race and try to make their run.
Yeah, I remember one of the derbies I cashed, this is what I remember, it was a long time ago, was Sea Hero, and Jerry Bailey was the rider, and he gave the horse an absolute perfect ride. The horse never would have won with any other rider, I don't think. And, that was just one of many really good rides that he had on the Derby. He probably was, in my estimation, the best jockey, a Kentucky Derby rider. I know Calvin Burrell kind of just was, he's sort of one-dimensional, but he had a lot of success with that one dimension. But I think Bailey, in terms of just the quality of rides he put on the horses in the Derby, he was the best. And maybe it's because I cashed on some of them, but yeah, to me, that's who comes to mind in what you just described.
A quick aside, you're bringing up a happy memory for me there. I was at the Derby that day, and I was with a friend who had a lot of connections in the horse industry and happened to know Mac Miller. And so we not only cashed all our pockets full on Sea Hero, but we got to go on the backside immediately after the race while the media was still there, and spend a little time back there with Mr. Miller. So it was a good memory, and not many days in racing like that. But you're bringing up a good one.
Yeah, I imagine that was a lot of fun. The one other thing I'll say about the big field, the 20 horses, is that horses that are used to being near the lead in the Derby now, with 20 horses, instead of sitting second or third, they might be fifth or sixth. And horses that are used to being mid-pack, instead of being fourth or fifth, now they might be 11th or 12th. And obviously the horses near the back of the pack now might be 19 horses in front of them. That kind of makes a difference too, I think. I'm not exactly sure how you factor that in your handicapping, but I do think horses might, they're in a position they're not familiar with, even if they run their normal race. Does that make sense to you? How, if any, do you? Go ahead.
Makes total sense, Chris. Sorry. It makes total sense, and it just points out even more the importance of the push button horse. I mean, if we can take some of that out by finding a horse that, we feel confident with the combination of its final times and overall ability mixed in with the right type pace figures and maybe the proper rider, although you don't even need a great rider on a horse like that a lot of times, just a competent rider. You have such an advantage in a race like the Derby because it's very likely that the push button horse is going to get to show who he is, that the dynamics of the race are not going to eliminate him or severely hamper his chances. Where if I'm looking at a horse like, that has to come from where Sea Hero had to come from, or, has to come from further back, you're bringing when you key that horse, you're bringing a lot more variance into play. You're taking a lot more risk on. And the rider becomes such a bigger component in the play. So what to try to make it completely clear, I would prefer to take an average rider on a push button horse, and if I were playing a closer, I might pay a lot more attention to the rider and design my play to where, if I love this horse that I know is coming from off the pace, and don't have a high level of confidence in the rider, then maybe I make 10 or 20% of the money I bet a key with my push button horse and a different closer, just as a hedge against, the mayhem that can happen in a Derby and is more likely to happen with a lower level rider.
That makes a lot of sense. It's one last thing on post position. I can't leave this topic without hitting this, is post position one. For a long time, because of the nature of the way the starting gate was set up at Churchill, it was actually kind of tilted, and horses actually started to the left of the rail. And so you kind of had to actually, the horse in the one hole actually had to move to the right a little bit in order not to run up into the rail. And so, nobody wanted that rail spot because they just felt like, you're going to get pinched back all the time. I think it was a little bit overblown, but it certainly was a factor. But now in the last few years, Churchill finally built a single starting gate for all 20 horses. So that gave them some extra room so they could slide the gate over now so that you can kind of start where you normally would have a starting gate. Given that change, do you think the one hole is the kiss of death still? Or, I mean, other than being an inside post like we described earlier, is there anything in particular about the one hole that makes it worse than, say, the 2 or the 3? Or with the new starting gate, is that a non-factor for you?
No, it's still a factor, but it's not nearly the factor it was. The one hole in the old setup of having 2 starting gates pushed up against each other, you're exactly right. I would describe it a little more dramatically than you did, where, it was unfair. In the old setup, the one post was, if you look straight ahead, you were looking into the rail. You didn't have any track once you met up with the true stretch and got out of the chute. So it was an totally unfair situation. And the only way that I would even think about a one horse back in those days was if I thought it was going to drop back, to last and make one run, and it wasn't really going to matter. But it was a total nightmare. Now it's, the horse has racetrack in front of him when you come out of the one hole, which is a good thing. And it's like you just said, it's the claustrophobic kickback trip that you worry about. So you look at where you project your horse to be in the early running and try to predict, how much of a hindrance that might be. The other thing to point out is, another thing out of the one hole is, I think, Richie Migliori, who I love to listen to, I think the phrase he uses is horses are like water. They go to open space or something like that. The one hole those horses will tend to, even still, to break a little inside and, they kind of veer away from other horses. And if they do that, then they're in an even worse spot. So just something else to think about. The other part of the new starting gate that's a huge improvement is that there was a gap where they used to put the 2 starting gates together in the previous setup, and that created some issues with the horse that was in the inside post of the outer gate, which I think was usually about the 15 maybe, had a tendency to break in from the same open space deal. So the new starting gate has definitely improved that whole situation. But yes, the one post is still a concern, and more of a concern with horses that have a certain running style.
Yeah, that's a good point about breaking towards the gap. In fact, that it was the 14 and 15, but the horses that usually took the worst of it was the 14, because the 15 tended just to break right into the 14 horse. So
Exactly.
They both took it.
Yeah.
But you're right. They do have a tendency to kind of go to empty space. And that gap was just like a vacuum or a magnet. And that 15 horse would almost always slam into the 14 horse right out of the gate. Not every time, but very often. So, yeah, I think people didn't talk about it as much, but I thought the 14 post was like as bad as the one hole back with that old starting gate. I would never want to draw it. But those kind of have gone away, but you're still saying, hey, that post one, maybe it's not as bad as it once was, but it's still not a good place to be unless you are a horse that just is probably going to drop right to the back anyway.
Yes. Or I guess if you thought a horse could go wire to wire and, maybe he could clear from there if he broke sharp, that that's not a possibility that comes up very often for my type of handicapping in the Derby, but I guess that would work too.
But that's the last part I want to talk about on these large fields is the break, because in a 20-horse field, in an 8-horse field, if you break a little slow, you might have fall back a few spots. If you're down maybe towards the inside or the middle and you break slowly in the Derby, you could have 10 or 12 horses take your spot. So that break, the horses that are able to, consistently break alertly versus horses that tend to be sluggish or have issues from the gate, to me, that's another really big factor, especially on the horses you want to lean on. Is that something that you consider as well? That ability to break consistently and sharply?
Absolutely. I take a lot of trip notes and, keep a database of trip notes and biases, and it's a lot of work. But one thing I find in there is horses that consistently or tend to just break a little slow. They can be talented horses, but they're just not great gate horses for whatever reason. I'll give you a current example is the horse that won the Louisiana Derby, Catching Freedom, that was his 5th start. And I'm just looking at my trip notes here, and I have 3 bad breaks out of 5 starts on him. So there's a horse that, he's a talented horse. That was, kind of impressive what he did in the Louisiana Derby. I don't know that the final time's going to be that great, but there's a betting horses from New Orleans hasn't been the path to financial success a lot of years in the Derby, but there's a horse that you're going to be put in the situation of in my handicapping, I will just assume that in the even with a great rider like Pratt, who may be on him, I will assume that he's probably going to break slow. And just like you described in the Derby, that's magnified by 5 for a normal 8-horse field that you see in everyday racing. So Derby handicapping, there's a lot of things, little things like the break, how a horse breaks initially that factor into your handicapping.
Okay, so let's move on to a couple other handicapping factors, and then we'll talk about betting. The trainer, we mentioned trainer. There are some trainers who've had a lot of success getting to the Derby, but not much success in the actual Derby. And Todd Pletcher comes to mind there. He's probably been the all-time greatest trainer at getting horses to win Derby preps, but his win percentage in the Derby is pretty abysmal. And then you got guys like Bob Baffert who, when he gets horses there, they usually run pretty well. So is there anything in particular other than the obvious that you're looking at in terms of, trainers in the Derby?
I'm looking, and I don't have the perfect word for this either, but for lack of a better term, I may call them old school trainers. And I know the Kentucky circuit better than any other circuit. So a lot of the guys that are my pets are guys that either, start most of their horses here now or were a big factor here previously where I got to know their styles. But for whatever reason, those type trainers, and I'll just name like a couple, this going back a little bit, but when you Street Sense and Carl Nafsker, I wrote about in Betting with an Edge, the kind of the style of a guy like Carl Nafsker, which is just slow stair step race by race development of a young horse where they're just slowly improving. His protege, Ian Wilkes is, has taken on that same style. Ian doesn't run a lot of horses in the Derby, but I'm using them as an example of just this slow, continual progression of a young horse. Shug McGahee is, his young horses tend to have a similar pattern. Once in a while, Shug gets horses that are bred so well. Once in a while, he'll have one freak in like one of their first two races, and then, that's off that progression angle and kind of off the table at that point. But a lot of his younger horses still follow that same path. Ken McPeak is kind of an example of that. And I'm going through a few of these just so the listener kind of gets the idea of the it's in California, it might be like the John Sheriff's approach. So you kind of get a feel for the kind of person I'm talking about. I think you get a little value with not just naming those trainers. My point is that style of training, whomever it is. I think you get a little added value in the Derby because, most horses that win the Derby are running a lifetime top. That's what we expect them to do. Not a lifetime top. They run a lifetime top up to that point. So that's what we're expecting them to do. And, almost any horse that pays a good price in the Derby is stepping up figure-wise, quite a bit. So it makes sense to me to look for trainers in the Derby that it's not out of the norm for their horses to make these improvements. And even if they don't win, they offer value, even if they're running second or third. And I know like a guy like McPeak is not really mentioned in Derby conversation. He hasn't had, the right horse maybe for a few years, but that type guy, I would, he has a lot of good young stock this year. He's getting, seems to be developing more of a program that are getting horses there a little earlier. That, I'm always looking for guys like that in the right situation in the Derby, just because my level of confidence goes up. Pletcher is a great trainer, and Pletcher, has won the Derby and obviously can win it again. But, I'm going to evaluate his horses differently. Not that they can improve in the Derby. They certainly can. But I'm not, I don't normally expect automatic improvement from certain trainers, whereas other old school trainers, almost always, when they point for the big race, it's pretty reliable that, whether they win or whether they run third or fourth, they're confident that their horses are going to improve, and they usually do. So that's a little different angle, but that's something that's been good to me and something that I think is a little undervalued on the board on Derby Day.
So I'd kind of characterize those guys. They tend to be a little more patient, and then they don't push too hard early and kind of let the horse develop naturally. And you're saying if they have a horse that's good enough to make it to the Derby, they're probably going to run the best race of their life in the Derby. And they may not have the same speed figures as a Pletcher or a Baffert or Brad Cox horse heading into the Derby, but they're much more likely to improve than those other horses. And so maybe it's not enough to win, but it probably means they're competitive and can at least hit the board, and you're going to get some value because they look a little slower going in. Is that kind of a good summary?
Absolutely. Orb is a little bit of an example of that. He was not a horse that I thought, the Shug trained him, and he was not a horse that all the way leading up to the Derby I was all that interested in. He was racing at Gulfstream that spring, and wasn't like really lighting anything up. But leading up to the Derby, he paired up a couple of numbers, and it looked like he was ready to move forward. And your Shug's that's his method of operation. So the pace looked to be super fast, and he was a legit closer. And it was a little bit hard to get to him maybe, but what pushed me over the top was the Shug factor. That the numbers I was looking at on Orb were a little light, but if he moved forward, and I fully expected him to, the projected number would probably be good enough to win most Derbies. So it just brings in a little extra way to maybe get a little. But you're looking, anytime a good handicapper can look at the race through a little different lens than most of the wagering public. If your lens is correct, if it's based on truth, then you're getting value. So that's a good angle. Another thing to touch on is Brad Cox is a unicorn. He's a guy that not only is he on the level of the same tier as guys like Pletcher and Baffert now, but he is in my mind, he's an old school trainer. I just watch the things he does, and a lot of them are, they're you see a lot of his young horses get on that slow improvement pattern and just stay on there, and just continually improve. So Brad Cox is a unique guy who he's not on my list maybe of old school trainers, but he may, I think there's a very good chance that Brad Cox will take over kind of the Baffert influence on the Derby, where, he's either winning or right there nearly every year. I look for, if I'm trying to project things into the future, Brad Cox is a guy that grew up a few blocks from Churchill Downs, and I think it's always going to be when he has a good young horse that he knows is a stayer. I think he's always going to be pointed right for that race. Well, like a lot of horses are, but I think Cox has the unique talents and skills and style of training that really work well in the Derby.
Yeah, well, he's certainly already made his mark in the Derby and in the Derby preps. So one other thing that you brought to mind, because this is something I think has changed just in the nature of training in general, but I think the point system encourages this. Where now, most of these horses have hardly raced, at all. They don't, they just kind of pointed to one good effort in one of the final two Derby preps to get him the Derby, and that's all they're trying for, and then they run him in the Derby. There's no more where horses have had 8 or 10 or 12 starts and 4 or 5 or 6 as a 3-year-old going into the Derby. I think that's part of what makes it a little harder to handicap. Does that change the way you think about these horses in terms of, their progression and stuff like that? How has that affected the way you look at the race, if at all?
I think you hit on it, Chris, in that it makes the race harder to handicap, because, I think anytime you have less data, in this case, fewer past lines in your past performances, that it's harder to separate the contenders and the pretenders. You know, it's easier for a horse to look good in 3 races and fool you, you know, not being the genuine article, but it, you know, 3 races into their career they can look like it, than a horse that had 6 or 7 starts, where a good handicapper can find the holes in that horse before it races in the Derby. So I think that makes it harder. It's very hard to. I think it's gotten harder to confidently eliminate horses for me as the training styles have changed over the years. It's just harder to know exactly what these horses are by the time they start in the Derby.
That makes sense. I mean, because they all have upside, right? I mean, as 3-year-olds, young 3-year-olds, they do, but as lightly raced young 3-year-olds, it's hard to predict, you know, which ones could improve quite a bit off of a few starts, and like you said, or which ones maybe just had everything go their way and they really aren't cut out for the, you know, the next level of competition. Just a lot more uncertainty, and like you said, more chaos, right? You have to factor in.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a couple more. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just agreeing with your comment.
So jockeys, you know, you talked a little bit about ones with experience. You know, you kind of already hit on this a little. Anything else to add on the jockeys other than, I think you've already mentioned that a jockey that maybe hasn't been running at a major circuit, you might be a little concerned. Doesn't mean they couldn't win. We saw that happen last year. And also, you know, the younger riders who are talented but maybe inexperienced. Anything else about jockeys that you're looking for as positive or negative in the Derby?
I'll just make one quick comment that don't underestimate just what a unique situation the Derby is. It just popped in my head while you were making that comment. I talked to a jockey one time who'd ridden in several Derbies, and he described well, first of all, the playing a mile of Kentucky home and just the electricity in the air that the horses pick up on during the post parade. But he said the most dramatic thing to him was when you come around the final turn and you're getting to the top of the stretch and you're starting to straighten out, that the horses will react sometimes, because he called it a wall of sound that the horses and the riders encounter as they get to the top of the stretch and face that grandstand and the crowd's roaring. So that just like burned into my mind how different an experience this is for a young horse or a first-time rider, let's say.
A little bit different than turning for home on Aqueduct on a Wednesday.
Maybe.
In terms of the wall of sound. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so one, I keep saying it's one, two more topics on handicapping. First of all, workouts. I mean, they get more attention than in workouts at any other time. You know, like you said, they have the work show. I think now it's Twin Spires does it rather than FanDuel TV, just because of the ownership of, but maybe this year it'll be on FanDuel. I'm not sure. But, you know, they have that morning show. There's a lot more talk about workouts. All of a sudden, everybody becomes an expert on workouts. How do you factor that into your Derby handicapping, that all that workout information you get?
Well, I'm not an expert on watching workouts, so I readily admit that, and I don't like to get up that early anyway. So I just like I described the body language of horses and the overall physicality of horses. I rely on people that I've learned to trust over the years that have tended to be right more often than they're wrong. So, I'm going to watch whatever show is on as often as I can. I may go back and try to catch, something online if I miss one, and just kind of try to stay on top of what the smart people are saying about how the horses are training. I'm going to read whatever Mike Welsh puts out. If Kate and Bradar makes a comment on air, which she has, or when horses are schooling, I'm going to listen to what she says. Anything that comes out of Maggie Wolfendale's mouth about a Derby horse, I'm going to listen to intently. I think she's tremendous. I've just learned to not put a lot of my time into that, but I know it's important. The only thing outside that group of experts that I will comment on would be, I like horses that get to Churchill a little early. And I do like horses that, and Baffert is known for this, that put in maybe a little more serious work, kind of I know not to get caught up in time so much on Derby week, but Baffert's horses sometimes would put in a little longer, a little more serious works than some of the other Derby trainers. And anytime I see someone, getting the first really highly respected or commented on work in over the Churchill surface, I'm going to take a little extra look at that horse. I like, if you get an extra work over that track, because that Churchill down surface is a little different. Not every horse immediately takes to it, and some horses tend to do better the second time they race over it than the first time. So it's a surface that takes a little acclimation for some horses. So I just think that's another box that you're checking. If a horse that you're liking is working before the other horses or gets to Churchill a little earlier, I think that's a positive.
So you mentioned the Churchill surface. It is a little bit unique. It does tend to dry out faster than any other track I've ever seen, I guess because it's a little more sand-based. Do you put more stock on horses that have had success at Churchill before? If not, if they haven't run at Churchill, is there anything you're looking for that would make you think they might like the Churchill surface? And also, anything you have to say about, sloppy track, because it does tend to come up sloppy a lot on Derby Day. Anything about the Churchill surface that's worth mentioning? Yeah,
I think you're right. I think it's a little the dirt there is a little different than some other places. Horses that have prepped at Keeneland, that seems to be an easy transition. You rarely see Keeneland form that doesn't translate into Churchill form. One thing I would, let me hit your slop thing too. The slop at Churchill, it be aware of potential bias situations when it gets real wet, when it gets sloppy. It's not always the same thing. I've seen from good rails to good speed to dead rails when it was sloppy at Churchill. So just be aware, you got to be light on your feet when you're trying to play the bias, but just be aware that when it is sloppy on Derby Day, the potential for a bias of any kind is heightened. So that's my general rule. I'm going to be a little more careful about that. One other thing I'll touch on that I don't hear much comment on is I always pay a lot of attention early in the meet, and the Derby's always, right at the beginning. You have 1 week leading into the Derby of live racing. There's a lot that can be learned in those few days of racing at Churchill before the actual Derby. So one of the things I'm always looking for is what feeder tracks are doing well. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason to that. It can be Oaklawn can be doing great, or in other years, Oaklawn can't hit the board. Same way with Fairgrounds, Gulfstream. I don't know what are all the factors there, but it's something to definitely pay attention to, because if I'm locked into a Fairgrounds horse, that's my Derby pick, I'm going to watch the dirt horses from Fairgrounds, and especially the higher level horses, and how they perform at Churchill relative to their odds in those days leading up to Derby Day, because that's important data that I think gets a little overlooked by the average horse player.
So that pretty much, I think, sums up the handicapping. Is there anything that we didn't mention about handicapping the Derby that you'd want to mention before we move on?
I don't think so. I think we gave it a pretty good run.
Okay, we're going to pause right there, and that will be the end of the handicapping portion of this Bet with the Best podcast with Mike Maloney, talking about how to handicap the Kentucky Derby. And our next podcast, which I hope you'll join us for, will cover the aspects of betting on the Kentucky Derby with Mike. So please, I hope you enjoyed this broadcast, and I hope you will tune in to the next one when we shift from handicapping and developing opinions about the Derby into how we take those opinions and turn them into smart bets on the Derby, and hopefully profitable bets. So again, thank you, Mike, for part one. Part two is on its way, and thank you all for listening, and may you boldly go where no horse player has gone before.